pleasure to present our today's event, which is called Gilel Storch and Swedish Humanitarian Efforts during World War II. We organize this event in the framework of a project which our museum, Jews in Latvia, has with Embassy of Sweden to Latvia and with Swedish Institute, the project called Remember React, and it's dedicated to Holocaust remembrance and countering anti-Semitism. And so we decided that event dedicated to Gilel Storch would be a proper beginning of such a project, because definitely Storch was one of key figures in Holocaust story and Holocaust rescue efforts. If we speak of our region, there are many interesting stories to be told, obviously. And so our talk will be in two parts. So first, I will say a couple of words about Gilel Storch from Latvian perspective. And then I will give the floor to our today's guest and someone we met rather recently, only maybe a few months ago, but whom we definitely already can call the friend of our museum, Robert Molander, grandson of Gilel Storch, who researched the story of the family and who grew up with his grandfather, not only listening to his stories, but also asking questions. I presume as many people related to the Storch family. And so Robert will present the major part of our today's story. So Gilel Storch and Second World War, his humanitarian efforts, his contribution to rescue of the Jews during the Holocaust, and a bit on his post-war life. We would be more than glad if you have any questions in any language. So I guess if there would be questions in languages we don't understand, we'll find a way to translate them. So we hope you enjoy current event. I also hope that everything works, everyone sees me, hears me. Those, well, me is not mandatory, but something that they want to hear. And also that our Facebook broadcast works properly. It should be, at least. So I will say a couple of words about Storch family, because Storchs are more than Gilel Storch himself. He's a part of an important story. And so I'll share the screen now. We'll start with his father, Avraham alias Storch, son of Wolf Storch. And what you see here on the screen, and I hope you see what I'm sharing, here is the excerpt from 1897 census of Russian Empire for the city of Daugavpils, where, as we know, Gilel Storch was born. And so we find their Storch family. Head of the family, here he is, number one, is Wolf, son of Simon Storch, aged 50, so born around 1846-47, who was born in city of Tukums in Kurland province and who resides here in Daugavpils. Then there is his wife, Golda Riva, daughter of Yakov, local from Daugavpils. And then their son, Avraham Elias, son of Wolf Storch, aged 30, so born around 1866, 67. And he was born in the estate or manor called Grenzental in Ilux district of Kurland province. So what we see here is this place back then called Grenzental. Now, formally it should be called Robežnieki or Robežciems or Robežmuiža, but actually it's non-existent. Yeah, so it disappeared from the maps already in the 1980s. Now there is a forest on that side. So it was a small manor. And what's interesting, nearby in Dviete, which is located approximately here, we find another Storch family from Tukums, someone called Gilels Storch and his family, brothers and cousins of Avraham Storch. So what it seems happened that somewhere in 1860s, Storch family from Tukums, because of whatever reason, but several members of this family moved within Kurland province here to these rural manors. We know that Gilels Storch was a distiller, so most probably they would run distilleries for local landlords. And so they stayed here, and then later Wolf, son of Shimon Storch, married someone from Daugavpils and moved to the place where his wife resided. Why this production of alcohol suddenly is important? Well, one thing is that many Jews would be dealing with distilling, producing and selling alcohol in the mid-19th century. Distillers among the Jews of Kurland province were considered to be sort of elite because they were providing nobility an important source of income, so they felt themselves important for the nobility. As one of the contemporaries wrote, that a Jew considers himself even a friend with German baron, not understanding that that's a sort of friendship that exists between a master and a dog. But also what's important, of course, producing alcohol means that you need access to grain. And actually in the same census from 1897, Wolf, son of Simon Storch, is listed as flour merchant. So he deals with flour, and as second source of his income is mentioned house owning. So they live in their own house in Daugavpils, in what is nowadays Aleis Street. Unfortunately, the building did not survive, and there is now a park on that side, and I was unable also to find any historic photos of the building. Why this flour business is important? Because when we see several decades later, Avraham Elias Storch, already a prominent businessman and public figure, he's mentioned, you can see it up here, he's mentioned as agency for trading flour and sugar. And so here he is listed, born in Ilux district in 1866. Why? Sugar and flour, both of these are important. So on one hand, through sugar trade and flour trade, we see this direct connection to distilling business. But also, sugar appears in one not very pleasant episode of Storch family history in 1932-34. Company A.V. Storch headed by Avraham, son of Ilya Storch, was involved in a rather unclear and rather problematic business with some of Latvian leading politicians, including some of the former prime ministers, concerning buying and selling sugar for exaggerated prices. So it was presumed that they were bribing some of the higher officials. Still, it's not very clear, but what is important, it seems that already at that moment, Storch family is acquainted with someone called Andrejs Bērziņš, who will play his role a few years later. But besides that, what is important, Avraham Elias Storch is prominent public figure. So when in 1936, there is an article detailing 50 years of public activity of Avraham Elias Storch. So they write that 50 years ago, in May of 1886, he was elected to the Daugavpils Committee of Zionists of Chovevei Zion, and later to the City Committee, and he was always the member of the Zionist committees since then. Already in his teenage years, he was in correspondence with all the world leaders of Zionism. Although he was brought up in a traditional manner reading Talmud, Avraham Storch, already in the age of 16, was interested in European literature, and particularly European philosophy, and he was obsessed with the idea of rebirth of Palestine. And so the apostles of Zionism of that time leave an immense influence on him. He was interested in all their writings, and he also established in Daugavpils a cultural circle called Meldei Shabbos. Their Hebrew language is taught, and Jewish cultural history is taught. And so he has been giving speeches on the topics of Jewish culture and Zionism for 50 years, and particularly in the Great Synagogue of Daugavpils, where he was an active member. It is also to be added that Avraham Elias Storch was not only dedicated Zionist, but he was also, for example, a longtime member of Daugavpils City Council from 1920, when Daugavpils stabilized under the control of independent Latvian Republic, and up to 1934, when stopped the elections to the City Council in Latvia, Avraham Storch was the member of City Council. And then, of course, there was his love child, oh, there is a problem with picture, but you can check it on Google Maps yourself. This building in Cietošņa Street 28 in Daugavpils, which was the third Loans and Saves Society, or usually it would be called Jewish People's Bank. It was established in 1900, and already in 1902, Avraham Storch joined the society. He also contributed some of his own money, but particularly he was important as a successful manager. And especially the bank developed in 1920s when it contributed a lot to restoration of the Jewish community in Daugavpils after First World War. And First World War was extremely calamitous for Daugavpils Jewish community and for the city in general. There were 120,000 inhabitants in the city on the eve of First World War, and only 40,000 after First World War. So 3 times less. A lot of buildings were abandoned. People were impoverished. Jewish communal institutions couldn't make ends meet. And so the management and also philanthropic activity of Storch family and of this third Loans and Safe Society was very important, and it was emphasized by many articles in the press. Particularly, they've emphasized that they already took rather low interest rates. So when other banks would charge 25, 27%, third Loans and Safe Society charged only 10%. Of course, such rates can be also, we may feel them very exaggerated by our today's standards, but these were pretty regular for 1920s and 1930s. And so when Avraham Storch died in 1937, his funeral brought tens of thousands of people. And so I'll read this brief description from the newspaper, and you can also see the photo of street in Daugavpils full with people during the funeral. So the burial of Avraham Storch was organized by the committee from representatives of the local Jewish community and other organizations. And so several Jewish youth organizations helped organizing it, bringing enormous masses of people who nevertheless worked in an organized order. Entire night before the burial, next to the coffin, there was an honorary guard from representatives of different local public organizations. On 12 o'clock on July 15th, next to the house of the deceased in Aizsargu Street, it was full with people who came to pay their tribute. The morning prayer was said by the friend of the deceased, Avraham Levin, who worked with him for decades in the Loans and Safe Society. The first stop was next to the Choral Synagogue, where the speeches in memory of Avraham Storch has said the Rabbi Rafalovitz, and the choir has been singing. Also, the Rabbi Fuchs would say the speech next to the Great Synagogue, and also the choir would be singing there. Finally, the funeral procession went to the third Loans and Safe Society building that everyone called the Storch Bank. Here, the speech was said in memory of the bank that has been orphaned now by the chairman of the board. All the Jewish shops along the route of the funeral procession were closed. Then there are listed people who spoke at the funeral, including people coming from Riga. And then it mentioned that among those who came to pay tribute to the funeral was also the mayor of the city, Yanis Volons. So Avraham Storch was not only prominent in the Jewish community, but also he was well known and recognized in the non-Jewish society, despite his name a few years before that in the press was mentioned in not the best context. Avraham Elia's name was not forgotten also after his death. So on the occasion of his death was a special foundation created or endowment aimed at charitable needs. And also what's important, his tombstone was transferred in 1970s from the Old Jewish Cemetery of Daugavpils to the New Jewish Cemetery. Old Jewish Cemetery was razed to the ground, but the grave, or at least the stone of Storch, was considered important enough to bring it to the new cemetery. And so his memory continues and it lives on. So what his son Gilel does, I'll concentrate on him because I know that Robert probably would say several things about other members of the family. So his son Gilel in 1930s already resides in Riga, and he's we could say, Riga representative of the company Avraham Storch. He deals with all kinds of things, and very handy comes his friendship with Andrejs Bērziņš, because Andrejs Bērziņš, up to 1934, when Kārlis Ulmanis organized the coup, overthrew, so the government, abolished parliament, abolished constitution, installed himself as a dictator, Andrejs Bērziņš becomes the chairman of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce and the chairman of the Credit Bank, so state-controlled bank, which is used to control and actually nationalize Latvian economy. And Storch somehow is close to Bērziņš. He, through Storch, Bērziņš organizes several important operations. First of all, there are still trading with sugar, and here the family business works. But also, for example, through Storch is organized import of the apatites, so the phosphate fertilizers from Soviet Russia. And if before that Latvia had to buy fertilizers in India and in South Africa, now they can buy it in Russia. And Storch somehow managed to get that Latvia does not have to pay with currency for it, but instead it exports its goods. So it's a mutually beneficial model of communication. So Storch becomes quite an important figure for Ulmanis regime, although Ulmanis regime is actually not very sympathetic towards the Jews in the economy, but it has some of the, let's say, useful Jews, or pocket Jews, as sometimes is called. And what's interesting, in 1940, in August 1940, when Latvia is already under Soviet occupation, in the newspaper Cīņa, the leading communist newspaper, official newspaper, appears the article how Ulmanis ministers became rich with the help of Storch. So Storch is presented by the Soviets as a kind of leading figure, one of the key figures in understanding of Ulmanis regime. So here I will stop. I've made certain points that give you a bit more context of what was the story of Storch family in Latvia and what was their reputation and what were their connections. And connections probably is the key to understand activities of Gilel Storch during the war. And it's my great pleasure to stop sharing and to stop wasting your time and to give our virtual floor to Robert. Please.
So thank you so much, Ilya. I have learned so much, and our family has learned so much from you. We had the pleasure of meeting in Riga in September, and it's been incredible how quickly you've been able to help us connect a lot of loose dots. I'm going to try to follow your footsteps, which is quite some substantial footsteps. And I'm going to share my screen. And it says only host or all participants. I assume all participants, Ilya. So I'm going to do my best to follow your story. And I want to start by saying that this is an important topic that I do want to talk about and share with you. It's not an easy topic, so I'm going to ask for forgiveness in advance if sometimes perhaps I may need to pause. There are several reasons why I think this might be important, and one of them, I'll mention three. When I say my grandfather, I'm speaking of Gilel Storch. One of his concerns was that this chapter would disappear from history. And I think we need to make sure that this does not happen. Number two, there's a lot to be learned and applied to other challenges that we confront today and tomorrow in how one person can actually make a difference. And number three, in order to make big things, really big things happen, there is some learnings here in that one needs to think different and not necessarily follow established guidelines and norms. And I can tell you, when it comes to following established guidelines and norms, Gilel would not be high on that list. But instead, it's important to challenge them and work around them and stay focused on what it is that you're seeking to accomplish. And by the way, you see a photograph here on this image, and in the center is my grandfather. And some of the former inmates that he helped rescue, to the best of our abilities. I believe these women came from the Ravensbrück concentration camp. All right, let's move on. One moment. There we go. Good. So the Storch family. So we've already learned from Ilya, especially for our international audience, that Daugavpils, which the Storch family referred to as Dvinsk, is in the southeastern corner of Latvia. And Gilel grew up as the eldest son of Avraham and Alta Storch. He had 6 brothers and sisters, and obviously we're going to focus on Gilel, but before we do, I'd like to briefly mention what happened to the rest of the family. So up on top here in the yellow circle, you have Gilel, right? And in the far left, we have his sister Rosa. Rosa, prior to the war, left to pursue her chemistry studies in France. And in France, she gives birth to a daughter. And they go into hiding after German occupation, which unfortunately Rosa does not survive. But her daughter does survive, and her family lives in France today. Then we have Judith. Judith is the youngest sister to the right of Abraham in the picture. She emigrated to Israel. She emigrated before the war broke out and built a beautiful family who lives there today. We have Xenia to the right of Gilel. Xenia marries. They have 2 children, and unfortunately are all killed in Latvia. The same is true for the youngest brothers, whose name was Wolf, as well as for Eugenia and her husband. Mulia, on the other hand, survives the concentration camp. But as you can imagine, in listening to what Ilya had to talk about with regards to the Storch family and the Soviet occupation, and Storch being a Jew and a capitalist, etc., he is, and he's still in Latvia, unfortunately. He's sent by the Russians to Siberia after the concentration camp. And he's there for 20 years. And he has a son and a daughter. And the daughter lives today with her family in Israel. As you heard from Ilya, the Storch family were strong supporters of Zionism, and they were shaped in a home where sense of community was a priority. And as being strong Zionists, already when Gilel was born in 1902, Avraham made him a member of the World Zionist Organization, and here you see a shekel that Avraham had issued for him. Hillel was inspired by Abraham and Alta's sense of community, or their commitment to their community rather. And he shared with me that a significant part of Abraham's earnings were donated to charity in a variety of ways to help others. Often on Shabbat, this is at the home of Avraham and Alta Storch. The Storch would host several guests, and here we can see, for instance, Latvian soldiers. Doing my best here to joining the dinner table, and this was very common. We've already learned that Abraham passed away rather suddenly in 1937, unexpectedly, and as Ilya mentioned, the funeral draws an enormous number of mourners. We also know, and Ilya mentioned it, that Hillel moved to Riga to expand the family business in the early 1920s. And among other things, he buys and he sells chemicals. He buys and sells horsehair, Russian IOUs or bonds. And in doing so, he establishes an extensive international network of contacts. And of particular future importance, and Ilya mentioned this a little bit with regards to fertilizers, of particular future importance becomes his exports of phosphates from Russia to Sweden. Why phosphates? Because phosphates is a key fertilizer ingredient that Sweden needed for its agricultural industry. After 15 years in Riga, Hillel meets and marries Anya Westerman, who's studying piano at the conservatory. And I mention here, the only reason I put the address up here because I was so amazed. So the museum that Ilya is responsible for, Jews in Latvia, is at the Jewish Community Center in Latvia. And it happens to be where the wedding celebration took place, right here. Same place, same location. So this wedding...
I'll just allow myself to interrupt you. So the background I have here is the entrance to the building back in 1920. So basically that's the view Hillel would see going for his wedding at the second floor. Thank you.
So please come and interject at any time, because I think it just makes it even richer as of a conversation. So, and it's just a few months after this wedding that, by the way, Abraham suddenly passes away, and we've discussed that already. In 1938, they give birth to, they have 3 children, and their first child is called Eleonora. And here we see her with Anya's father, Max Westerman, who the entire, the immediate family, they perish in the war. Good. We know then that the Red Army on the 17th of June in 1940 moves into Latvia following the von Ribbentrop non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin, and the independent Republic of Latvia ceases to exist and becomes part of the Soviet Union. Hillel decides that they need to get out, and he uses the only opportunity he has, which is a 6-day business visa for Sweden. and he departs 1 month after the Soviet occupation. As you can imagine, this is a very difficult decision, as he leaves behind his entire family, his wife Anya, and at this point, their nearly 2-year-old daughter, Eleonora. And by the time then that Germany invades Latvia on the 1st of July, there are different sources, but I believe there's about 93,000 Jews in the country. And frankly, none of them stood a realistic chance of getting out. Gilel was fortunately able to finally get Anya and Eleonora out right before. There are several theories as to how he was able to get them out. And one theory that appears most likely is that they were part somehow of some form of a prisoner exchange with Russia. But what we do know is that Anya was greeted by a Swedish pilot in Riga. She was given 24 hours notice to only get her daughter and herself out. And they arrive in Sweden. We actually know precisely when, on the 21st of May, just some 5-6 weeks before the German invasion. And by 1943, they have 2 more children that are born in Stockholm during the war, Marcus and Ruth. Ruth happens to be my mother. Now, Gilel realized early on the full implications of Nazi Jewish policy. Many would say earlier than most people. And he engaged with multiple collaborators in several rescue missions. It's complex, and I've tried to consolidate and make things concise here. I can tell you he encountered many setbacks, several failures, but that didn't stop him. He just kept going. And the initial focus was on his personal family. And then it just expanded and expanded. Latvian Jews, really anyone that could be rescued. In an effort to create perceived leverage, and this becomes even more important as we have this talk, he establishes the Swedish section of the World Jewish Congress. This became his official platform to work from. My grandfather was, during his entire life, a very unconventional man, and this worked to his advantage during this tumultuous times. He was definitely resourceful, determined, I would say courageous, and he had the ability to be very persuasive. Wouldn't take no for an answer, and these became very important assets in such an extraordinary situation. And this, combined with his ability to identify and establish important contacts, became critical even with his ability and willingness to connect with representatives of leading representatives of Nazi Germany. And we're going to talk more about that. So starting with family, he first tried to, through a variety of German banks and through a German spy, Edgar Klaus, he tried to rescue the rest of his family. You can see here, this was a topic at the time, Kan man Juden loskaufen? Can you buy Jews? Klaus worked in Stockholm for the German Abwehr, the German military intelligence, under Vice Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. And the two connected, and it resulted in Klaus, in August of 42, he actually traveled to Germany. This is well documented. He was escorted by Swedish police. And he was equipped with a list of names. You see here, this list of names right here. A list of Jewish names and addresses of people to be rescued. He was going to take the ferry from Sweden to Germany, from Trelleborg to Sassnitz. And he learned that in Sassnitz, Germany, he was going to be greeted by the Gestapo, and he became concerned. He gets cold feet, and in Sweden, he asks for permission to go through his papers. He does, and he tears up this list on the 18th of August, 1942. After he leaves, the Swedish police gets curious as to what it is that this German person decided to tear up. And they decide to go through the garbage and piece the pieces together, which they do. And that's why we know this story. The list is filed with the Swedish Police Archives. In June of 1944, my grandfather was approached by a different individual by the name of Peter Kleist, working for the German Foreign Office. And Kleist had been sent to Stockholm to explore the possibility of a separate peace with Russia. And he starts with building goodwill with the Swedes and enables the rescue of 8,000 ethnic Swedes from Estonia. When my grandfather hears about this, he goes, well, you know, if he can get people out of the Baltic, he should also be able to get Jews out. And he asks Klaus here to introduce him to Kleist. And they have several meetings that result in Kleist offering Storch 2,000 Latvian Jews, 2,000 Latvian Jews in exchange for sanitary goods at a value at that time for $400,000. Storch gets enthusiastic. He connects with the Americans. There's someone by the name of Ivar Olson at the US war refugee based in Sweden. And together they approached the Swedish Foreign Office. But unfortunately, they were unwilling to bring that many Jews to Sweden at that time. And I think this really became the last rescue attempt of the family and any Latvian Jews. And in total, 18 family members were killed. But one thing started to change. Was it connected to this or not? But concurrent with this, we started to see the Germans shifting in their strategy. They started to shift from killing all remaining Latvian Jews and instead started to move them to East Prussian work camps, hypothetically to use as potential bargaining chips. Okay, the story goes on. In April of 1944, the Swedish section of the World Jewish Congress learns that Hitler plans to kill Hungary's Jews. And they come up with an idea which on the surface seemed incredibly far-fetched and certainly impossible. The idea, and I want to emphasize, my grandfather was part of this. There were many people involved. He was one of several people engaged in this project. The idea here was to engage a reputable non-Jew with Swedish diplomatic immunity, number one. Number two, that this individual would travel to Hungary, equipped with provisional Swedish passports called Schutzpass. Such a thing never existed before. It's something that, from what I understand, my grandfather invented as an idea. The idea was to distribute these provisional passports to Hungarian Jews for protection. And there was inspiration here because in the fall, the year prior, there was a lot of collaboration with regards to bringing the Danish Jews to Sweden. So people started to think differently about rescue efforts. The group identifies Raoul Wallenberg. They approach him and he accepts. Then they propose the idea to, again, Ivar Olsen, who is, again, the US war refugee representative in Sweden. And in turn, this provides the additional leverage needed with the Swedish Foreign Ministry. And the key contact there that my grandfather worked with throughout the war was Gösta Engsell. He was really head of the legal department at the Foreign Ministry, but as part of his duties, the handling of refugee issues fell on his desk. Sweden decides to agree and grants Wallenberg diplomatic immunity. And in June of 1944, Wallenberg leaves for Hungary, and I think most of us are very familiar with what happened, but really initiates one of the most important rescue missions of World War II. And this required the collection of names that were going to be matched to passports, provisional passports, and Storch works in Stockholm to collect thousands of names, provides these lists to the Foreign Ministry, which sends them to Wallenberg. And this continues through January of 1945. Next story. The same month that Wallenberg leaves for Hungary, Storch receives reports of several food shortages, severe food shortages in the concentration camps. And he comes up with the idea that we need to deliver food packages directly to the camps and the inmates. I mean, this is a seemingly impossible project. How do you deliver food packages to concentration camp victims in German occupied territories while there's a war going on? Anyhow, he approaches the Swedish National Food Board, and they immediately reject any ideas of any food to be exported, as food was in short supply. And it was rationed. Here you have a rationing coupon. Storch finally persuades the food board by simply not accepting no for an answer. He receives the licenses, the permits, secures the Allied permissions, the financing, and he sends initial shipments in November of 44 by mail and then by rail. And then importantly, connects with Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross and asks if he would be willing to deliver and serve as the infrastructure for these efforts to really scale up the operation. And Bernadotte and the Swedish Red Cross, they agree. And now it becomes even much more substantial. 40,000 packages are delivered, 2.5 kilos each. And the operation is so successful that the US War Refugee Board pays for an additional 40,000 packages. So in total, 80,000 packages were delivered. And Storch even receives delivery receipts signed by Jews in the camps. Now we are moving into the beginning of 1945. And in the beginning of 1945, reports starts to surface. I mean, Germany understands that the war is going to come from their perspective unfavorably to an end. But Hitler issues an order with the intent to blow up the camps with the inmates inside prior to any one of them being liberated by the Allies. So Storch immediately pursues different avenues, and Sweden becomes much more open to the idea of providing assistance. And in February of 45, actually the 13th of February, they issue a decree saying that they're willing to receive all Jews imprisoned in Germany without any restrictions. The following week, in late February, Storch is introduced to Felix Kersten. Felix Kersten is Himmler's personal physician. They meet in Stockholm. Himmler is incredibly dependent upon Felix Kersten. They have a deep relationship. They actually meet at the family of then young Olof Palme, who the future Prime Minister of Sweden. And he personally witnessed this meeting and documented and described it later on. Realizing that Germany was doomed, Kersten had received permission by Heinrich Himmler to move his family to Stockholm, but there was a condition. And the condition was that there had to be a direct phone line directly to Himmler's office, such that Kersten could come to Berlin at a moment's notice. And this becomes, in my grandfather's view, an incredible opportunity to work with Kersten and negotiate directly with Himmler, who was in charge of the Holocaust. And the negotiations are initiated. And in March actually the 21st, Himmler agrees to release 5,000 Jews to Sweden. He promises to hand over the camps to the Allies intact with the inmates alive. And due to these negotiations, the Swedish Foreign Ministry decides to expand the Red Cross bus mandate to also now include the non-Scandinavian Jews. And for any Swedes that are part of this conversation, we talk a lot about the white buses. And this is what this was about. This becomes actually the largest rescue operation on German territory during World War II. As many as 30,000 camp inmates were saved and brought to Sweden. 11,000 of the 30,000 were Jews. Now there's a story that is unique to Bergen-Belsen, because on the 8th of April, my grandfather finds out through Edgar Klaus, remember the German spy, that Ernst Kaltenbrunner had made preparations to blow up Bergen-Belsen the following day. They make, thanks to that phone line that Kersten has to Himmler, they made an immediate call to Himmler's aide, whose name was Rudolf Brandt, via that phone line to make certain that Bergen-Belsen would be preserved. And actually 2 days later, Felix Kersten receives a letter from Brandt, dated the same day, April 8th, indicating that Himmler had sent a special commissar to Bergen-Belsen by the name of Kurt Alexander Becher. And here we don't know exactly what happened, but from our understanding, we understand that the commander told Becher that he had specific instructions from Hitler to blow up the camp, and allegedly Becher said, let's call Himmler. Anyhow, the camp was preserved, and on the 15th of April, British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen and found around 60,000 prisoners in the camp. Growing up with my grandparents, hearing these stories, and they were complex and many times not sequentially presented the way I'm sharing it with you today, was confusing. And I would ask my grandfather a question. And you might be thinking of the same question, I don't know. But my question to him was, how were you able to negotiate with the Germans? Why would they listen to you? And what could you possibly offer in return? And when he heard this, he laughed, and he called my grandmother over and said that this was a very good question. And he then told me what I'd like to play a little clip for you, which is recorded by Svante Hansson, a political science professor at Uppsala University. I hope it works.
Why did German agents and later members of the German government like Himmler want to negotiate with a totally unknown Jew in Stockholm? It was not because of the power of Storch himself or anything that Storch could give. It was for a very simple reason. The Nazis had been preaching and were themselves believing in the existence of a secret Jewish world government. It was behind all the governments of the Allied nations. They really believed in that.
So I think this gives a lot of insight. And there are many stories that exemplifies this. I can tell you that my grandfather had a very unusual meeting with someone by the name of Fritz Hesse in March of 45. He was from the German Foreign Department in Stockholm. And he contacted Storch and had a meeting and said, quote unquote, "We Germans and you Jews have common interests. You want to save Jews and we want to save Germans." And Hesse proposed on behalf of his government to Storch and the World Jewish Congress that they were prepared to release 500,000 Jews to a neutral country. And in return, they would need to get the help of the World Jewish Congress to persuade the Allies to stop bombing Germany for a month. Storch said that he would mention the meeting to the American and British ambassadors, which he did, and also set up a meeting between Hesse and Roosevelt's emissary in Stockholm, Ivar Olsen. The meeting happened. It didn't lead anywhere. But what we do know is that Olsen, the American representative, took the offer very seriously, and together with the American ambassador reported to the United States State Department that the Nazis are prepared to liberate remaining Jews. The US government showed no interest in such negotiations, but I think the insight is critical and it leads to something. And that became probably my grandfather's most important task, which was to encourage the Germans in their own conviction that it was worth keeping the Jews alive. And this task included the willingness to negotiate directly with Nazi Germany's top leaders, including Heinrich Himmler, something very few were probably willing to do. I can tell you that people around my grandfather many times perceived him as completely undiplomatic, uncompromising, stubborn, and again, an unusual ability to be persuasive. His imperfect command of the Swedish language certainly did not hold him back. British diplomats, he actually negotiated about increasing quotas with British diplomats for immigration to Palestine of Jewish people fleeing the Nazis. They characterized him as, quote unquote, overbearing and crazy. But in these unconventional times, in a world where perhaps civil courage was in short supply, these were some of the qualities that were necessary to perhaps make a difference. At least it was for my grandfather. I can tell you that he lived a full life. with Anya until 1983. And upon his request, he's buried among the many concentration camp survivors who died shortly after their arrival in 1945. And I would like to play a short clip for you. There we go.
Många är död. Det finns inte många som är vid liv. Jag, Engsel, Erlander och andra. Om vi dör kommer detta kapitel att försvinna för historien.
So having this conversation today, for instance, I hope you agree, is one way to help make sure that we don't forget that chapter in history and learn from what occurred. My grandfather started on this after the war, and he first focused on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising represents the largest single Jewish World War II resistance effort. And this is an interesting story. My grandfather learns that after the war, that Albert Speer had ordered a large amount of Swedish granite to be utilized for a World War II Nazi victory monument. Obviously, the monument was never built, and the granite was resting in Sweden undelivered. And he came up with the idea of, why don't we repurpose Hitler's granite to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? And the granite was secured with support from the World Jewish Congress, from Skandinaviska Banken, Jewish communities abroad, including South Africa and in Argentina, and personal funds. And the memorial was unveiled on the 19th of April, 1948. It used to carry a plaque saying that it was donated by the Swedish section of the World Jewish Congress. Then we have the Raoul Wallenberg Monument in New York City, which was dedicated in 1998 as a gift of the family of Gilel Storch. And this was completely organized by his son, or my uncle, Marcus Storch. The name of the monument is called Hope. It's designed by Hungarian-Swedish artists Gustav and Ulla Kreitz. It is made of five large, very large black columns mined from Swedish bedrock, standing on paving blocks or cobblestones from the former Jewish ghetto in Budapest. Off to the side, you can see a bronze replica of Wallenberg's attaché case, representing the lost diplomat in action. And this attaché case reappears in several locations. And one of them is in front of the Swedish Foreign Ministry, actually in front of the main entrance, perhaps serving as an inspiration for thinking differently. We also have something called the Gilel Storch Award, which is given to people whose work has promoted democratic, universal, and humanistic values. This started in 2018. There's a sculpture that you see here, designed by Swedish artist Jakubowski, Annie Winblad Jakubowski, and it symbolizes eternity with its design of two leaves. You can also interpret it as a person reaching out his or her arms. It's administered by Judisk Kultur in Sweden, and Marcus Storch serves as the chairman of the award committee. In 2018, it was given to Joachim Gauck, the former president of the Federal Republic of Germany, for his struggle against oppression and democracy, and for democracy, and freedom and human rights, in particular with regards to the peaceful reunification of East and West Germany into United Germany. In 2019, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court, received the award for her contributions of in regards to human rights and the equal value of all human beings, particularly with regards to the equality of women and men. She actually studied in Sweden and even spoke the Swedish language. And in 2020, former Prime Minister Göran Persson received the award for his contributions to the struggle against anti-Semitism and building and supporting a very substantial Holocaust education framework for the Swedish school systems. And he shared the award with political activist and feminist Gloria Steinem for her work with the women's liberation movement and civil rights movement and the Equal Rights Amendment. Finally, when we look back at Avraham and Alta Storch, in round numbers, 80% of the family perished, 20% survived. And today that family is spread across Israel, France, the United States, and Sweden. And we were disconnected. And frankly, in part thanks to the power of social media and a few other tools, we were able to reconnect. And I can tell you, it happened for the first time approximately 80 years after the family split. And we met in Stockholm. We had a fantastic time celebrating family, resourcefulness, determination, and a strong bond to preserve our combined legacy while moving forward in life. And that brings my talk to an end, and I turn it over to Ilya.
Thank you, Robert, for a great presentation. So now the questions are welcome either in the chat, or you can raise the hand and I'll give you the floor with the voice, whatever is more convenient for you. So there are actually a lot Latvian connections also during the Second World War and after the war, that are, so to say, underexplored. And for example, we used as a cover for this event on Facebook the photo of Gilel Storch and Rabbi Mordechai Nurok, a prominent Latvian politician, former member of Latvian Parliament, and one of the leading figures in World Jewish Congress in the late 30s, who was arrested by the Soviets, then released under the pressure of American Jewish organizations, and who traveled to Sweden in 1946 and was pretty active in many aspects of Jewish public life. And so we see that also after the Second World War, Storch did not leave his connections with Latvia, although obviously it was impossible for him to go to Latvia, to Soviet-occupied Latvia, but this connection persisted, and Storch with Nurok, for example, were very active in later period, late 40s, fighting for recognition of Israel and promoting Israel on international platforms like UN. So his activism did not stop at the Second World War and the Holocaust. And probably another very interesting story can be told about Storch's post-war activities, and both public and philanthropic. So I see in the chat tons of words of gratitude. So we would be also glad to take questions. Please don't be shy. Also, any comments and additions would be highly appreciated. So I see here some people who also have researched many things related to Second World War and history, and also who are knowledgeable about some aspects of history of Storch family. So we would be really very glad to have your contribution, because it's really about Gilel and his work, not about showing off us. So we'd be really glad to take questions. So there is a question, a small coda about revelation of Klaus after the war. Maybe Robert mentions. Robert?
I'm not sure what coda means, but Klaus, Edgar Klaus, that German spy, we don't know much about. We know a little bit about Edgar Klaus, but there's a lot of things we don't know. He's a rather mysterious person. Why would he help? Why would he do this? And some people may think even that he worked as a double agent of sorts. Edgar Klaus was actually from Latvia, and he's worked. He worked, as we know, in Stockholm for the German Abwehr. I'll just tell you an interesting story about Edgar Klaus. He died not that long. I mean, I don't know. I don't recall the year, but he didn't live for a very long period of time. He died in Stockholm. He was found in his apartment, and he was clasping in his hand a Mondovid, a Star of David. Did he have a Jewish connection? We don't know. He took a lot of mysteries with him in his passing, but he was clearly an important connection for my grandfather early on, and even throughout. I mean, it was through Edgar Klaus that my grandfather found out that Bergen-Belsen, for instance, was going to be blown up. And then they went to that famous Kersten phone line and contacted Himmler's office. But if it wouldn't have been for Edgar Klaus, nothing would have happened. So interesting. I don't know if I'm answering your question, whoever asked it, but he's definitely an interesting character. And it speaks to the fact that there were many people involved here. My grandfather was one component.
So there are two other questions. So concerning question if the recording will be shared, yeah, so recording will be available in a few weeks on the YouTube channel of the Museum Jews in Latvia. Yeah, so as this is an open event, we do not keep register lists, but you can check in 2-3 weeks our YouTube channel, and the recording will be there. So another question from Mitch Lieber. What can we learn from Gilel's character that is instructive for facing human rights challenges today?
One person can make a difference. I can tell you what, I'm sure many people will have better answers to this than I. But a few suggestions would be that one person can make a difference. In unconventional times, conventional thinking needs to be put aside, and you need to do things unconventionally. I mean, the whole idea of sending food packages to concentration camp inmates, to issue, passports to Hungary, all these things were, on paper, the most bizarre ideas possible. The British called my grandfather three things. I already mentioned a few things, but I mentioned three more. They called him stateless, arrogant, and a lunatic. For being willing as a stateless Jew during the war to negotiate with leading Nazi representatives of Nazi Germany. This is not conventional thinking. So I think thinking unconventionally, thinking different, and being determined, willing to fail, but staying persistent on your goals are probably some learnings, and I'm sure many others could add many more insights than what I have articulated.
Thank you. And another question, did Gilel Storch, after the war, had any connection with the story of Latvian so-called legionnaires who were interned in Sweden, who later were returned to the Soviet Union, where of course many of them were imprisoned? So did he have any involvement in this story, which is kind of important for Latvia?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, so what we know a little bit about the connections of Storch and Latvian political figures in the emigre community, but it seems they did not end up with good communication after all, particularly because if Latvian politicians hoped, and particularly, for example, Latvian ambassador to Stockholm, Salnais, hoped that through Storch and his efforts, it would be possible also to rescue Latvians, and so the Jews would be part of this rescue mission. It seems that at a certain stage, Storch learned that actually there are no Jews to be rescued more in Latvia.
Yeah.
So he said that he's not ready to work in this direction because sort of rescuing Jews is his primary goal, and so it seems that there was not too much of the communication probably between them afterwards, but actually I guess unfortunately someone who maybe could have commented on that, Matthew, has left already, and so then there is a comment. Swedish Foreign Ministry appointed Count Folke Bernadotte in mid-1944 to represent Swedish interests related to negotiations with Kleist and Storch, about 2,000 Latvian Jews. Storch worked with and developed relations with Bernadotte from that point. Probably that's exactly part of these complicated negotiations, because what we know is that at least certain information about Holocaust in Latvia reached Storch. It could be already in autumn or maybe even late summer 1942. So and not only about Holocaust in Latvia, but also about Holocaust in Latvia. So some of the people in the audience may be familiar with the name of Gabriel Tsivian or Gunārs Cīrulis, so a Jewish teenager who escaped from Riga ghetto and with Latvian ID card managed to get to Switzerland, and where he filed a report to American embassy and American Jewish organizations. And later, after the war, he became a prominent Latvian writer. Also there was a report of someone called Leonid Zeba, also a young Latvian man who with fake Latvian ID, went as a sailor to Helsinki and from Helsinki to Stockholm, and reported probably in January 1943 to Storch about what happened in Latvia. So we can say that probably by 1943, Storch was rather sure that there are no people to rescue in Latvia. Technically, of course, there were people who can be rescued, but at that point, probably he did not yet have the methodology for rescuing them. Yeah, because again, that's my speculation on this. In this case, is that of course what was important, that successful rescue actions were mostly in the West. Yeah, so where there were still Jews in significant numbers, and so where the Swedes could intervene. Yeah, so in Eastern Europe, most of the Jews would be in places of imprisonment, but that by that moment and in very small numbers. So then there is a question if there is any book about Storch.
Yes, there is. There is a book which is written by Lena Einhorn, called Handelsresande i liv. That is translated in English to Trading in Lives. This book also became a movie. There's in English, the title is Stateless, Arrogant, and Lunatic, quoting the British. And this book certainly is in Swedish, and I know it's been translated into German. Unfortunately, there is not a commercial copy available in English at this point. But the short answer to the question whether there's a book is yes, there is a book, and as well as a movie. And and the clips that I used, and I showed it in the slides, and I mentioned it down below, were actually excerpts from the movie Stateless, Arrogant, and Lunatic, produced by Lena Einhorn, including a featuring of, as you heard, my grandfather in 1973 being interviewed by the Swedish television.
And also there are several articles dedicated to him, so not maybe particularly to him, but to context of his work, and so to what we can call Swedish humanitarian efforts and the issue of refugees in Sweden. And so I can check now the name of the article that may be helpful, and it's available on Google Books. So yeah, and so while I'm looking for the link, there is also a comment that some Latvians tried to pass as Jews, and sort of trick Storch hinted, and Storch found it out. As far as I know, what I know is based on the research by Latvian historian Uldis Neibuks, who researched Latvian Central Council, so the important Latvian emigrant resistance organization in mid-40s. So there was not so much attempt to deceive him, but to use Storch's connections also to rescue Latvians. And Storch was not interested in that. Yeah, so the main idea of Latvian politicians was to get through Storch connection to Americans and to use, let's say, American money or American resources also to rescue Latvians. Yeah, and so we know that the major sort of rescue actions happened in 1944 when the Soviets were advancing, and so many people got to Sweden. Actually, just a couple of hours earlier today in Riga was the presentation of a book dedicated to people who did these transfers. So I think it's not so much an attempt to, to deceive him, yeah, but rather to utilize his connections. Yeah, and he was clearly uninterested, and this is reflected in also in American documents. Yeah, so that he is not really dedicated to that cause, but something like he thinks that if Latvians want to do that, that's up to them. Yeah, but as it basically does not have to do anything with rescuing Jews, and I'm not getting involved into it. So yeah, so then someone posted information about the Lena Einhorn movie here in the chat, so you can follow the link. Yeah, so and Ellie Valk writes that probably Yad Vashem doesn't have the copy of Lena Einhorn book. I don't know if the book is still available. Is it in print, Robert?
It's in print. But as I mentioned, Swedish and German I'm not sure if there's a third language, but certainly in Swedish and German. It's a start.
Yeah. So so the book that I would like to recommend, which has also the section on rather broad context of activities of Storch. Here is the name of the book. It's published rather recently, and so there is an interesting article about activities of Storch, particularly in the very last part of the war, and also his connection with Rabbi Nurok. And one important aspect which is described in the book and which Robert politely omitted from his talk is the complicated relations of Gilel Storch with the Swedish Jewish institutions during and also after the war. Yeah, because obviously Swedish institutions, Jewish institutions were either afraid or didn't feel enough power to intervene on behalf of world Jewry. So Storch was in a rather tense relations with them, and so
the tense relationship with the Swedish Jewish community continued through the entire aftermath, and one has to be fair to the Jewish community as well, but they were under a lot of pressure. They were probably afraid of importing a German innovation. They had also been obliged by the state to be financially responsible for any Jews coming to Sweden. My grandfather had, on a scale from 1 to 10, kind of a -2 understanding for their concerns. And he goes, so there was a head-on collision where my grandfather was incredibly impatient with what he perceived to be a lack of energy and enthusiasm to do something, in his view. I'm sure there are many views on this topic, but one thing is clear: there was a substantial difference of opinion, and that continued throughout afterwards.
Okay, so I see no new questions coming in the chat. I don't know if anybody wants to ask anything. I see that people are starting to leave. So then probably I would say once again, thank you to our today's presenter, Robert Molander, for really great presentation and very interesting, and on a topic that is not so well known in Latvia so far, but we hope that this presentation will help to raise a little bit of awareness, and also obviously the issue of refugees and contemporary problems of human rights make Gilel Storch's activities important and, let's say, mind-boggling for today very much. So thank you for everybody participating. I hope for nobody that schedule was too early or too late. We tried to accommodate all the time zones. And so the recording will be available in a few weeks on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much. So this was presentation by Robert Molander in the framework of Project Remember React, joint project of Museum Jews in Latvia and Swedish Embassy to Latvia. There will be other projects, and we'll definitely stay in touch with Robert and with those of you who are interested, and we hope someday there'll be something else dedicated to Gilel Storch, his deeds, his contribution, because definitely there is a lot to research. Thank you so much, and have a nice day, evening, morning, or whatever your time zone dictates you.
Thank you, Ilya.